Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. The Forgotten Boleyn Son, George Boleyn. The Boleyn family fell spectacularly from grace during the reign of Henry VIII. Their fortunes rode on the back of the marriage between the King and Anne Boleyn, his second wife, and the Boleyns became one of the most prominent families during the Tudor times, and they accumulated a huge amount of land and wealth. 2 Boleyn girls would take to the king's bed, with Mary becoming his mistress also, and George Boleyn would become a trusted and favourite player at court. But when Cromwell was ordered to find the king a way out of his marriage to Anne, huge scandal hit the family, when Anne was accused of adultery, incest and treason. But one of the men accused of sleeping with her and plotting against Henry VIII was her brother George Boleyn. But there was a very interesting and colourful character that became prominent and part of Elizabeth I's court, the daughter of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII. This man was a priest, and he was known as George Boleyn. But was he the forgotten Boleyn boy, and the rumoured son of George Boleyn and his wife? Now, very little is known about George Boleyn, the Dean of Lichfield's life. It's not known when he was born, possibly around 1520. The rumour about his mother and father centre around the possibility that he could have been the son of George Boleyn and his wife Jane Parker. If this was true, then he would have been the first cousin of Elizabeth I. There was no record of Jane Boleyn and George having a child, but this is a possibility that it was not recorded or had been lost to the history books. Jane Parker, or Jane Boleyn, Viscountess Rochford, was a woman who had to endure her husband's adulterous affairs. George was a well-liked and prominent member of Henry VIII's court, but he had many mistresses at court. But the George Boleyn who became a priest could have also been a distant cousin and Boleyn relative who was related in some manner to Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn was the mother of Queen Elizabeth I, so if a family link came to George Boleyn, then it's likely that he would have secured his place in Elizabeth's court. However, despite the tenuous possibility of him being a lost Boleyn son, he managed to survive the downfall of Anne Boleyn and her family. Following the scandal, very few people had anything to do with the Boleyns, and they lost a huge amount of wealth and land, and many members died in shame, never returning to royal court. But George Boleyn was different, as he would emerge later from the shadows to come to royal court. In the November of 1544, he entered Trinity Hall at Cambridge University to study, and he was a pupil of John Whitgift, who went on to become the Archbishop of Canterbury. He graduated in 1552, and then received a master's qualification in 1560. But he was destined for a career in the church, as he gained an admin role in a church in York shortly after. He then became the rector of Kempstone in Nottingham, and he also worked in many other churches. But from a church in Canterbury, some shocking accusations were fired at the priest. In the September of 1573, he faced a number of shocking charges and accusations. It was said that he had threatened to nail the dean of the church to the wall, and in a violent outburst he also hit one of the canons, William Ealing, with a punch to the ear. He also had attempted to hit another canon, Dr. Rush, and hit another inside the chapter house, whilst he also punched a lawyer. It was said that he had a sharp and quick temper, which would run in the family, and he admitted that he could lash out and swear at people when provoked to do so. But despite this, he gained promotions in the church. In the December of 1576, he was installed as the Dean of Lichfield, and further promotions came. He did resign from one post a few years later, after being involved in a dispute, but he was known for being a man who was part of Elizabeth I's court, and was described as a colourful character there. Elizabeth's court was grand, and was where many people wanted to end up and be a part of. Being popular at court could bring power, influence and further wealth, but it is interesting to consider whether George Boleyn's place at the royal court was gained through his family links and his possible relation to the Queen. At the time, some people did believe that he was the son of Jane Boleyn and George Boleyn, but little is known about his family history or early life. Some records from Cambridge suggest that he was perhaps the son of George and Jane Boleyn. After his death in 1603, shortly before Queen Elizabeth I, his supposed cousin, died, his will claimed that he was a kinsman of Lord Hunsdon, who was the grandson of Mary Boleyn, the eldest daughter of Thomas Boleyn, and the father of George Boleyn, the Viscount Rochford. What is interesting is if George Boleyn the priest had been the legitimate son of George and Jane, then he would have been a claimant to the titles of the Earl of Ormond and the Earl of Wiltshire, which Henry VIII gave to the Boleyn family. But there's no record of the Dean of Lichfield, George Boleyn, making a claim to these titles. There have been claims that George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, did have some illegitimate children, and it's claimed that when George was imprisoned at the Tower of London and later executed, an illegitimate son, Thomas Boleyn, was moved to Cluny Castle for his safety. But little is for certain when it comes to the family history and lineage of George Boleyn, the Dean of Lichfield. We know that he was at the court of Elizabeth I and that he was a well-thought-of religious priest, despite his temper and outbursts. But if he was the son of the Viscount and Viscountess Rochford, then this would have made him a claimant to all the lost Boleyn lands, and he could have been very wealthy indeed. Also, during the reign of Elizabeth I, he may have gained significant favour, because Elizabeth herself was a Boleyn girl, being the daughter of Anne. She had very few members of her mother's family left who had not been shamed, or who had not been outcasted, so possibly in George, the Dean of Lichfield, she may have felt some links to her mother's family. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.